We will talk about prejudice. What causes prejudice and what forms can we see? Prejudice is defined as a tendency to overgeneralize in some way, usually negative toward an entire group. Parts of prejudice is 1. Overgeneralization. It's the tendency to think of or react to everyone in a particular category in a more or less fixed way, based on the category. And secondly, overgeneralizing or prejudice limits variability within a category. There are different types of prejudice: cognitive, affective, conative. Cognitive prejudice is a belief about a group, what someone thinks about a group. Affective prejudice is a dislike for a group, a feeling towards a group. And conative prejudice is a desire to behave negatively toward a group. You want to act out, usually in a harmful way, toward that group. These distinctions are important because you can reduce one without affecting the other. For instance, we can learn about different types of prejudice, a cognitive way of addressing prejudice. But learning about something may not change how you feel about something. Stereotypes. Stereotypes is defined as an exaggerated belief associated with a category of people, and usually these beliefs are exaggerated beliefs. With stereotypes, we see little variety in a category, and we say things like, they act like. They all seem to be like. We tend to categorize and overgeneralize. You may be wondering if this is something that we can't get away from because we have these patterns that we develop. And these patterns are good. These prototypes are good. However, when we make stereotypes, that is different than making just a general pattern. We need patterns because it's fast and efficient. However, there's some problems that come with stereotyping. We need prototypes because it's fast. It gives a basis for immediate action in certain circumstances. They are also shortcuts to thinking. It makes us more efficient by freeing up cognition for other tasks. And again, efficiency is important. It allows people to cognitively engage in other tasks. They don't have to spend so much cognitive energy thinking about how to approach a particular situation, object, or thing. However, when we stereotype, we may make faulty judgments about whomever we stereotype. Typically, stereotypes are based upon illusionary correlations. Illusionary correlation is a belief that two variables are associated with one another when no real association exists, and that is again defined as an illusionary correlation. You may see often in the news about violent events such as crime, and often you see the weapon and it's tied to a particular racialized group. There is no real connection between that gun and that particular group. We tie them together to make an illusionary correlation. So how do we do this? What brings it up? There are two factors that cause an illusionary correlation. 1, an associative meaning, and 2, shared distinctiveness. Associative meanings are two variables that are associated with one another because of the perceiver's pre-existing beliefs. Once the stereotype is activated, the person engages in biased processing of social information by attending to information consistent with the stereotype, ignoring other information that contradicts it. And so we have a self-confirming belief. There's next, shared distinctiveness. This is about when two variables are associated because they share some unusual feature. When we start grouping people in categories, we tend to have an in-group and then an out-group. An in-group is a group of which a person is a member with or which he or she identifies with. These are in-groups, I belong. Whereas an out-group is a group to which one does not belong and with which one does not identify. What's also important about these groupings is that we tend to define ourselves by what we are not. For instance, I know myself as a Black woman. I am not a man, and I'm not a white woman. And so again, I know who I am based upon what I am not. Stereotypes is a mixed bag. It can be both positive and negative. For instance, here's some very blasé stereotypes which still have quite an effect. For instance, Asian Americans are viewed as the model minority. The model minority is a person in a group who is hardworking, academically strong, and mild-mannered. Those are all positive categorizations, but they're all stereotypes too. So what if you are not hardworking, academically strong, or mild-mannered? Does that make you not Asian American? And here's another one. African Americans are perceived as good dancers and singers. However, these particular good stereotypes are used to offset the true stereotype that they're not seen as intellectually strong. Okay, so the good is used to ignore the bad stereotypes. We don't pay attention to it, although the effects are still there. And all these stereotypes are part of a hegemonic process. This is about a force that is placed upon us with our ideas that are part of our culture. We see these stereotypes reinforced in various institutions like school, the media, our neighborhoods, and so on. So this is kind of a soft power that we use to really benefit some groups and really harm other groups just by the way we think. So I want you to be self-reflective. How have stereotypes affected you? And can you be honest about the ways you use stereotypes? Are there any stereotypes, negative and or positive, that are linked to your ethnic, racial, gender, or religious group that you identify with? Now, are those stereotypes true about the groups that are part of your background? Do you recognize when people associate you with those stereotypes? And when you do notice that, what do? Do you just hold it in? Do you challenge a person? What do? And lastly, if you're honest with yourself, how would you really think about how you stereotype others? When do you do it? And why do you do it? Now we'll talk about what causes prejudice. Well, there's various theories out there, and the one we're going to focus on now is Theodore Adorno's authoritarian personality, developed in 1950. He states a person prejudiced against one group is likely to be prejudiced of others who are culturally and ethnically different, although these groups may not be real in themselves. Prejudice, according to his theory, is a personality characteristic, and these prejudices that they hold may not always be based upon personal experience. And what's also important to note is that although a person may be prejudiced, that does not always indicate conservatism, so it's not a political identity. Adorno used an anti-Semitism test and an ethnocentrism test to really see how people are prejudiced. Anti-Semitism is prejudice and discrimination against Jewish people, and ethnocentrism is a tendency to view one's own group as the norm or standard, and to view outgroups as not just different, but also strange and usually inferior. And authoritarianism is defined as a tendency to support political movements that demand conformity and submission to authority, often espousing prejudice. And having an authoritarian personality makes people more prone to being prejudiced. And there's a list of characteristics associated with authoritarian personality in the book. When people are practicing prejudice and also stereotyping, we tend to go to the next level and point people as scapegoats. And scapegoating is a tendency to take out one's feelings of frustration and aggression against someone or something other than the true source of one's feelings. For instance, when we have an economic downturn, we tend to focus on minority groups of various types and saying they're stealing our jobs or they're ruining the economy, instead of really focusing on what's truly causing the economic downfall. Another tactic that we may use when we stereotype groups is projection. And projection is a process whereby people minimize or deny characteristics they see as undesirable in themselves by exaggerating these same characteristics in others. So things like, oh, they're lazy, or they're not hardworking, not as intelligent, selfish. But when we have those in our own groups, we see ourselves as entrepreneurs or independent and hardworking. So we just reverse the same things toward our own in-groups. Like Freud, Adorno believed that adult personalities reflect childhood personalities. So again, you learn this prejudice and stereotyping as a child, it will grow, and it will be an adult who also stereotypes and is prejudiced. So people who are prejudiced overall tend to be insecure about their own qualities. They don't really have a good self-esteem. They tend to be very concerned about status. At least they feel okay with having someone below their status, even though they may not be in a particular status of power. And they also need to see the world in simplified terms. One particular way of viewing this is a person who has a just world mindset. So they would think that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. So when we see atrocities in the news, they're like, well, that person deserved it. They must have had done these bad things. However, when it's a person in their in-group where bad thing happens, they try to also rationalize it and trying to find justice for that group. For instance, let's go back to Aurora, Colorado, where a man shot up a movie theater. It wasn't just that he killed many people, it was that he had mental illness. So we justified his acts. He did this thing because he was unwell. Whereas if a person of color shot up someone, well, that's a broken community. They don't deserve, any kind of help to build up that community. So the authoritarian personality test by Adorno has many faults as well. It's not a perfect test. And here are some of the criticisms. 1, scales may have measured yay saying, or people just saying yes to a certain question, rather than prejudice or authoritarianism. Next, this particular test deals only with right-wing or fascist authoritarianism. And we know that people who are liberal or progressive can also be stereotypical, or people can also stereotype. The 9 dimensions of this personality theory is not well supported by research. The 2 main dimensions of right-winged authoritarianism and social dominance orientation have been criticized. Right-wing authoritarianism speaks about conventionalism, submission to authority, and aggression against those who do not submit to authority. This is centered around the need to obey and respect authority. It also reflects a need for control and security, and it's reflected in values of conformity and traditionalism. Social dominance orientation is centered around the belief in importance of a hierarchy. It reflects the need for feelings of dominance and superiority, and reflects a strong interest in winning. And so this occurs often in situations where groups have to compete. When people are acting out in prejudiced ways based upon their stereotypes, it may be because of a social threat more than an actual threat, a social threat, being that they feel like their group is losing resources or being attacked. Next, let's talk about social learning and symbolic interactionist approaches to prejudice. Social learning is a theory that holds that prejudice and other attitudes are learned from parents, peers, and others with whom people, especially children, associate. So they say that this idea of being a prejudiced person, authoritarian person, this starts in childhood. Symbolic interactionism argues that agents of socialization use symbols to pass along to children their understandings of social reality and social expectations. So any object word has a meaning attached to it, and that we learn about this through our socialization as children. So when a person becomes prejudiced, this particular style of theory would not say it's due to a person's personality, but that they learned it. So children develop their own self-image through socialization. They'll also develop ideas of how they identify through socialization. And this affects how people understand their social worlds or how things really are. Attitudes of significant others may be more important than the child's own attitudes and opinions. So if a child is looking up to an authority figure or someone that they feel close to, they may have different views about a particular subject, but they'll go to their loved ones or the important person's views and adopt them for themselves. Growing up in a society with sharp inequalities reduces racialized prejudices and discriminatory behaviors in children. They simply are following societal norms. Growing up in a society with sharp inequalities produces racialized prejudices and discriminatory behaviors in children. Children are learning from their environments. They are just simply following societal norms. So who's more likely to be prejudiced? A person who is upper class, middle class, working class? There's been lots of research about this, and some may think that it's pretty simple. People with a lower socioeconomic status, people with less education are more likely to be prejudiced because they may not know how to think in a complex way. Well, that's not always true. First, let's talk about what socioeconomic status is. One's position in societal ranking systems is indicated by such criteria as income, wealth, educational level, and occupation. So when people are being tested, let's say by a survey about how they are prejudiced, they may know how to actually take tests. They know how to not look undesirable to the person assessing their survey. So what is actually happening is that they're being tested about their sophistication, about how they take tests rather than how they are prejudiced. Middle and upper class participants know better than to make strongly or clearly prejudiced statements. They know that's undesirable. What we're really seeing is how they know how to put on and act. They know how to speak and act in politically correct ways. They know that color blindness is what we tend to use when we talk about race or other types of inequality. Lower status members of majority groups feel minorities as competition or threats for real resources, for jobs, for housing, for education, and so they're more likely to say how they're feeling because they see minority groups as a threat. So, education. Education can help reduce prejudice because people are better able to understand complex ideas and situations. They have more tolerance for complexity, and ambiguity increases. There's no right or wrong answers. There's kind of like a nuanced way of understanding things. Education also is a problem. It reinforces prejudice. Students tend to learn the ideologies of the dominant group in their classrooms. They may not be introduced to other forms of understanding or histories or ways of thinking than what is produced by the dominant group. So curriculum also matters on how to reduce prejudice.